Thanks so much, and thanks to the Practical Farmers of Iowa for having me be part of your webinar series. I had the privilege last year to attend the Midwest Cover and Grains Conference in Minnesota and met a lot of very innovative farmers and doing very similar things to what we're doing here on our farm. So today I'm going to talk to you about managing residues in a four-crop rotation. Our farm's transitioned quite a ways over the last 10 years, and we're going to share some of those journeys with you and give you an idea of what we're doing up here up north. So this is a picture of our homestead. We live in the beautiful rolling hills of Cavan, Ontario. And for those of you that don't know where Cavan is, or Peterborough, or Toronto, there's a map of Ontario here. And where that red arrow is pointing is where we're located. We're about an hour and a half northeast of Toronto. And we farm on basically some loam soils. And like I said, quite a few rolling hills. And our fields are quite small in comparison to some of the fields in your area. Our largest field is 45 acres in size. So our farm was established in 1902, and we're a sixth-generation family farm. The family originally settled the area here in the 1840s. We're formerly a hog operation with a 900 sow farrow to wean. Our farm is about 500 acres in size, and it's become quite diverse over the last 10 years. We have a market garden, and we're primarily grain farmers. So we farm corn, soy, wheat, and oats. But we also have some diverse landscapes where we have some forages, some hay for the horse markets, woodlots, and some grasslands. About 5 years ago, we started a compost and soil amendment program, and I'll talk a little bit more about that during the presentation today. We also have a commercial passive solar greenhouse. And a couple of years ago, we got back into the livestock market by introducing some sheep on the farm, and we'll show how they integrate into our current system as well. For 35 years, we've been producing maple syrup, and 5 years ago, we certified to organic production. And I just want to mention as well, if you have any questions, just keep them for the end. We've got lots of time at the end of the presentation, and I'm happy to answer or go back to any slides that you have questions about. So as mentioned, my name is Norm Lamothe, and as of 2020, I'm now a full-time farmer. Previous to that, I was an entrepreneur, co-founding a leading North American ag tech startup. And for about 15 years prior to getting into the farming space, I worked in the aviation space. Formerly an educator, I did teach at a local college in their food and farming program, an entrepreneurship class. I'm also an agricultural advocate and a lifelong learner. So I love sharing ideas, I love learning from others, and I love hosting groups on our farm here, as well as part of our education days. So my journey into what I call regenerative agriculture started in 2015. My in-laws were at the fork in the road in their farming lives, where they either had to sell the farm or pass it on to someone in the family. As no one in the family was immediately interested in farming, and having helped out on the farm for several years, I decided it was an opportunity for me to continue the legacy of the family farm, but also become more involved. And it also kept me home because I was on the road a fair bit at that time. So right around 2015 is when we really got involved. And this is a picture of my son. And this was a program called Soil Your Undies. And some of you might be familiar with it, where you take a pair of clean white underwear, you bury them in the soil, and after 2 months, you go back to see if the underwear have disintegrated or if they're still intact. And the premise behind the program is if you have really healthy soils, the microbial activity and the bacteria in the soil will have deteriorated the underwear and consumed all of the cotton, and you should really just be left with that elastic band. Well, it was a little bit warm that year, a little bit dry, and much to my chagrin, the underwear were still mostly perfectly intact after 2 months. So that really got me thinking about what's happening in the soil. We spend so much time focusing on what's above the ground, but that really exposed to me the importance of starting to look at what's happening under the ground. And so that led to everything like looking at the variability in our fields. So with the ag tech startup that I founded, we had drones as part of that technology. And so we scouted our fields on a routine basis using the drone technology. And through NDVI imaging, we're able to realize that we have a lot of variability. So this is our largest field. It's 45 acres in size. But even in such a small field, you can see there's areas where the plants are really healthy and where they're quite struggling. And up until this point, we were kind of managing all of our fields, and for that matter, our entire farm, the exact same way. We're putting the same amount of fertilizer across all our acres. And this really got me thinking about, one, how can we reduce our inputs and our costs, but should we be feeding the plants differently based on their potential? And that led to a lot of research, a lot of reading, a lot of learning, and a lot of reaching out to our extension here in Ontario is called OMAFRA. And we were invited to participate in an on-farm research program, which began in 2020. That project on our farm looks at things like rotation, off-farm amendments, and cover crops. And we're now in our 5th year, and we're already starting to see some of those changes. And the positive changes that we're seeing are statistically significant. So we're really excited to see that the best management practices that we're employing on our farm are actually making a difference. So this is my soil regeneration philosophies. Increased rotation is a huge part of successful building of your soils. In 2016, we added wheat to our rotation, and in 2019, we added oats. We also reduced our tillage significantly here in the last 10 years. And I put a little asterisk next to minimum tillage because there are occasions when we do have to till the ground, either for nutrient stratification purposes or for residue management purposes. And of course, if there's rutting or any activities on the farm that require some remediation, there are circumstances when we do that. But I would say generally 90%, 95% of the time, our fields are on a no-till basis. We also started adding cover crops with the introduction of cereals in our rotations. And now we put cover crops in 3 of our 4 rotations. And generally speaking, we like to have our cover crops over winter. It's a much different management strategy and quite challenging at times, but we find that having those living roots in the soil continue to feed the microbiome, the bacteria, and then those populations don't have to spool up once a new crop's introduced. A lot of amendments. I quickly learned that increasing organic matter was a key to success, and it's really difficult to increase organic matter using sort of even BMPs on the farm. But by bringing in soil amendments, we were able to accelerate that program, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And like I mentioned, in 2022, we added sheep to the operation, and we use them in a rotational grazing fashion. We'll talk a little bit more about that also. So just to give you a little bit of background about what our farm is and what we're dealing with in our area, we're typically a loam. We have some sand loam and some silt loam, but generally, fairly porous soils. We're very high on pH, mostly due to our high calcitic soils, and typically 7.5 to 8.1 on our pH levels. So we don't do a lot of liming on our farm, and we're always trying to bring those numbers down to that 7.5 or 7.0, but that's just what our soils are and what we have to deal with. So we have CECs in the mid-20s, and our organic matter is generally 2.5 to 3.5%. When I first started farming and from a 2-crop rotation, we had some numbers that were down 2.0, and this year for the first time I saw 5.0 on one of my soil tests. So we're really happy to see some of the changes are happening, but it's a very long program, and it's going to take my lifetime to bring those numbers up to 5% across the board. As I mentioned, very high calcium, 4,500 plus parts per million. Some farms would love to have more calcium on their farm, and we can't get rid of it. It ties up a lot of our nutrients, especially some of the micros. We have good macro levels, mostly from legacy hog manure. Phosphorus is about 30 plus parts per million, and our K is around 100 parts per million across the board. Our soils are very, very, very low in magnesium, sulfur, boron, and sodium, and we're generally putting magnesium and sulfur with any dry fertilizer application, and we'll apply boron either foliar or in furrow with our planters. We have very high zinc, manganese, iron, and copper. So we don't have a lot of micronutrients that are in the middle. They're either really, really high or really, really low, and we have to manage those accordingly. So for us, learning about soil and learning about different management techniques and employing best management practice really starts with a soil testing program. I'm not sure in your areas if soil testing is a common practice, but in Ontario here, we're not doing enough of it. And it's really important to have that baseline to then be able to make smart economic and ecological decisions from. On our farm, we use what we call site-specific soil sampling. And what you see here are these polygons, and they're representative of like areas. And we've established those using all kinds of data layers. We have elevation data, we have historical drone data layers, we use some satellite layers, we use our yield data and any field observations that we have. Certainly moisture plays a role in that as well with the hills that we live in. And there's areas where the nutrients sort of pool. And then you've got some tillage erosion from historical tillage practices where you've got clay exposure, or the beef profiles are exposed on the nose of the hill. And so we manage and remediate those areas differently, depending on what's there. A little bit of background about our crops. We're at 2,800 heat units in our area. And just to put it in perspective, Ontario is a relatively large province. And from one end of the province to the other and north, there's only 2 or 3 hours drive before you're out of agricultural areas. But as you go further south, you can increase 100 heat units for every half hour you drive, essentially, all the way to the border near Detroit. And so we live in a sort of moderate climate here. We're a little bit far from the lakes. We get quite a bit of snow in the wintertime, and our heat units are not as high as even an hour south of us. Typically, we'll have about 30 to 40 inches of precipitation annually, and what that equates to is about 20 inches of rain during the growing cycle. We grow about a 90-day corn, and our average yields are between 73 and 177 bushels. And that's over the past 5 years. And the reason why I'm showing you those ranges is we've had a drought here for the last 8 years. And we have to manage water as best we can. And some of the BMPs and increasing that organic matter is going to help us hold some of that water long term. Soybeans, 21 to 52 bushels, generally Roundup ready, and we plant them on 30 inches. And then our oats are a spring planted crop, and we've had between 30 and 140 bushels per acre. They're drilled and generally underseeded with red clover. And similarly, our wheat, we range between 29 and 90 bushels average. And I'm sharing those low numbers with you because, there's good and the bad in agriculture. And we have to manage all of those factors every year. As I mentioned, we're a research farm. We host several research days here on the farm annually. This is a colleague of mine, Ted, who is down in his soil pit. And on the right-hand side here, this is the on-farm team doing some population counts on our oat crop. This was a record oat crop for us. That was a 140 bushel average across the entire farm, not just this field. And as you can see, the oats are pushing 4 feet tall. Probably about 6 or 7 years ago, we started looking at adding those farm amendments to increase the organic matter in the soils and trying to accelerate building the soils. We've tried several different methods and techniques. We make a little bit of biochar here on the farm, sort of as a test project over the last 5 years. We've applied municipal biosolids that come out of the waste treatment plants locally. And we've also brought in quite a bit of mushroom compost over the past 5 years as well. We also make our own compost here on the farm. Our local municipality has a leaf and yard waste program where they collect these brown bags of leaves, grass clippings, branches, and they drop them off here at the farm. We charge a small tipping fee for that. And we process those materials in this machine. It's like a TMR mixer. It's called the Zygo Eco Green out of Europe. It's essentially a large grinder that pulverizes all of that material into a nice fine soil. And then we turn those windrows using a windrow turner. This is built here in Ontario, and it's a PTO driven machine. And we can turn about 400 tons of compost per hour with this. So where we have large compost yards and windrows, it's a very effective tool to turn the compost. We blend not only the leaf and yard waste, but also some hay and straw and any other agricultural residues that we have available. And we also combine some wood chips and forest biomass, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a bit as well. In 2024, we launched a forest biomass recovery program. And this came out as filling a gap in the local marketplace. The Ontario Woodlot Association was in need of remediation in a lot of their privately owned forests. and we were looking for biomass to increase the volume of our composting program. So they approached us with a need, and we knew that we wanted the materials. And so we launched a forestry division to capture those materials, chip them, and bring them back to the farm. So this is a machine that we purchased from Sweden. It's a feller buncher forester, and it's a dual purpose. So it also has a trailer that you can attach to it and collect the materials once you've harvested everything. Here's a picture of our operation. Our forestry division primarily operates during this time of the year, during the winter months, and that allows us to keep some of our staff, our key staff, on through the winter months as well. And so here you see 2 trucks, an excavator that also has a grapple saw for harvesting, but also for feeding the chipper, and an 18-inch chipper. So we service local clients by helping them remediate their forests by doing plantation thinnings and taking all of that material to chip to bring back to our farm. And another project that we started looking into in 2019 was the production of biochar on the farm. Through my research and looking at increasing soil organic matter and increasing microbial activities in the soil, I identified biochar as an opportunity to do that in our temperate climate. Unfortunately, at the time, we didn't have the supply of biomass that we needed to justify the capital costs of building a biochar plant. With the new relationship in our biomass recovery program, we now have the materials that we are looking for to feed the biochar plant. So about 50% of all the trees that we're chipping and the biomass that we're recovering from the forests will go to the compost stream. The other 50% will go into our biochar plant. So in early 2024, we began designing a biochar plant. And a very exciting moment for me is tomorrow we're supposed to receive the physical plant itself here on our farm. And so it's been 5 years in the making. And the plant itself will produce approximately 2 tons of biochar per day, utilizing approximately 10 to 13 tons of wood chips. And really, we're setting up this and this research project as a demonstration so that other farmers might be able to do the same on their farms in their local geographies. Moving on to some of our best management practices. Cover crops play a very important role for us in our rotations. We see cover crops as an opportunity to scavenge nutrients, to help with moisture retention, and also to keep those living roots in the soil year round. We underseed our cereals to red clover, and we like red clover for a couple of reasons. We can put the seed down at the same time as we plant the crop. But also it gives us an opportunity that if it doesn't work or it's not a great catch, that we can still recover the cover crop by planting a multi-species mix post-harvest. So we've had good luck with red clover in the past, typically growing between 3 and 4 feet tall. And as you can see here in the right-hand picture, this is oats that are underseeded to red clover. And we're applying red clover anywhere between 6 and 8 pounds per acre and getting a fairly decent stand from that. In our corn, we also apply cover crops. We split our nitrogen applications, and what we did is we built a wide drop sort of side dresser, and we put a cover crop seeder on the front of that same unit. So we're limited by our equipment as to what stage we can do side dressing in our setup. And as you can see here, we're going in at that 6 to 8 leaf stage in the corn crop, putting down a second pass of nitrogen. That's sometimes variable rate based on NDVI data. Sometimes it's a flat rate, and we're just able to judge a little better at that stage of plant growth as to whether or not it needs all its nitrogen, more nitrogen, or less nitrogen based on conditions. And as we're going through the field in that same pass, we have this little APV yellow cover crop seeding unit, which is a hydraulically driven fan, and it blasts the cover crop under the canopy. It's not ideal for emergence in the sense that there's not a lot of seed to soil contact, but generally speaking, we've had decent catches of that cover crop, and we typically try to time both our nitrogen and the cover crop ahead of a rain event as well. This just gives you a little bit of perspective of the types of cover crop and the growth of cover crop that we have. That's my lovely wife, Emily, standing in a cover crop. And this would be the 15th of May. So this cover crop would have been planted in a wheat field. And you can see here at the 15th of May, the volunteer wheat from the previous year's crop is already in full head. and the red clover is probably 3 to 4 feet tall. We've tried a lot of scenarios on how to manage that cover crop. We've planted directly into this. We've mowed it. We've terminated it on the day of planting. We've terminated it early in the season. We've terminated it in the fall. And we've had varying successes in all those scenarios. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. Here's a scenario where we planted a multi-species cover crop following wheat that was primarily winter killed. So what we're left with is only the wheat, the volunteer wheat crop, and we planted directly into that. And so we have a 12-row corn planter, 30 inches. We've got downforce, row cleaners, auto shut-offs, and it does a pretty good job of sort of splitting that weed out of the way and planting. And you can see there in the right-hand picture all the little rows where the crop would have gone in. On the front of that tractor, there's a liquid fertilizer tank. We've moved a little bit away from applying liquid fertilizer. We haven't seen a great economic result from doing so. And what we're doing now is we're putting biology in that tank. So from our compost, we're making an extract and putting that in furrow, along with some of the micronutrients that the crop might need. We're talking about residues and managing residues. Our wheat is planted into a crop that was previously oats. And so what we end up with is red clover that was underseeded in the oats. And then we terminate the red clover. But what usually ends up happening is all the volunteer oats that were in that crop didn't get a chance to germinate because of the heavy clover crop, or they germinated underneath the clover. And so when we terminate the clover to plant the wheat, now you have this flush of oat seeds, and it doesn't take long for them to sprout. So by the time we go into plant our wheat, we're sometimes planting green in a wheat field. So we're drilling our wheat into 3 to 4 inch oat crop, and this is what it looks like in the spring. So you have this large mat of dead oats that are winter killed, and wheat that's trying to come up through them, and it doesn't always look great. I often joke that I probably shouldn't look at my wheat until June, because when I go out there in May, as in the left-hand photo, it looks pretty poor. The emergence looks like it's kind of spotty, but by the time harvest rolls along, it looks much better. So the picture on the right is a picture of the exact same location as the picture on the left. And that wheat in that season went 130 bushels in that field. So it's important not to be discouraged and to try new things. And sometimes if it doesn't always look good, it doesn't mean it's going to be bad come harvest time. In managing our cover crops, we've tried numerous techniques, from mowing to harvesting in this case. So this was a field that was going into corn. It was red clover and volunteer wheat. We decided to mow the entire field and pick it up with a forage harvester. We probably should have been bagging this material and feeding it to our sheep, because it was extremely rich, looked delicious, it smelled great, but we were not really set up for silage in our sheep operation. And so we windrowed it in our compost yard, and it became part of our compost program. This scenario here was great in the sense that it collected a lot of biomass. We were 2 to 3 tons per acre in mid-May of growth coming out of winter. But the problem was it took a long time. It took us almost 2 days to harvest 25 acres of that material using this technique. And at that time of year, it's really challenging because we are trying to plant crops. The newest technique that we're trying to deploy across multiple acres is our cover crop grazing program. And so our sheep, we have about 100 of them now, 75 ewes. That's going to double again here in May when they go to lamb. And we rotate them through the cover crops. So on the left, you see here, that was a wheat field that was underseeded to red clover. On the left-hand side of the fence, you can see that that's been grazed, and the sheep are then moved to the other new section. They're eating pure red clover essentially, plus any volunteer wheat that might have sprouted. And they do a pretty good job of cleaning it up. They eat every leaf off the red clover crop, and they leave the stems. But that really helps us in managing that residue and the crop itself the following spring. The problem right now is that even with 100 sheep, they're only eating about an acre and a half every 3 to 4 days. And so we're moving them regularly. They get moved every 3 or 4 days, but they just really aren't doing a lot of damage to the crops. I think this field here was 25 acres, and they grazed it for the entire fall, and they even regrazed some of the regrowth as well. This is our latest attempt at managing our residues, and by far the best at this point in time. We're cutting the cover crops in the fall. So this was an oat field that was underseeded to red clover, and right ahead of planting our fall wheat, or winter wheat, we disc mined the entire field. We raked it up, and then we picked it up with a machine that we purchased. This is a self-loading forage harvester, and we're able to drive this machine through the field at about 8 miles an hour, and it self-loads. The rear tailgate opens up, and it plops it into these beautiful windrows, which ultimately become our compost piles. So what we're doing in this scenario is we're taking the cover crops off the field, along with all the straw from the previous crop. We're windrowing them. We'll compost them there for a year, and then we're going to put them right back on the same field as a nutrient source. We'll blend these with the wood chips from our biomass recovery program, and then we'll also add some biochar into those compost piles moving forward as well. And we see this as the best opportunity for us to manage our residues, to retain our nutrients, and to increase soil health. And by doing this activity in the field where it's going to be used, we minimize a lot of the travel that we were finding with our primary compost yard of moving that material around with the manure spreaders, which was very time consuming, and transportation was a big cost of that program. So this is what the field looks like after it was harvested. You can kind of see the line there right next to the tractor that's going through the field of where it was sprayed off. We sprayed this field a couple days before we planted it. We're drilling wheat seed. In this case here, it was a soft white wheat into this field. So we're end of September here now. You can see the leaves starting to change in the background. And then you can see the windrows of all the material that came off of those fields. So this was a 35 or about a 35 acre field. And in those 3 windrows that you see there, there's probably close to 300 tons of biomass, plus the wood chips that we'll add to those here this spring. We'll compost those through the year, and then following the wheat harvest in the fall, we'll reapply that material as a compost product to the field. And this scenario here, we saw much better emergence in the fall of the wheat crop as well. It wasn't competing with the volunteer oats. It wasn't competing with the clover or any of the residue. And our no-till coulters did a much better job at preparing the seed bed ahead of the double disc openers. There's another picture of it there. So you can still see there's some short clover regrowth that's happened there, but that's been sprayed off. And similarly here, we're putting biology in with the seed. We've got compost extract in the liquid tank on our drill. We've got no-till coulters ahead of an older Case 5400 drill. It's probably one of the pieces of equipment that we'll next replace to a newer system that's got a little bit more downforce and better depth control across all of the openers. But generally speaking, it's a very cost-effective way for us to plant our cereals at this point in time. So when we think about cover crop residue management strategies, there's really several options for us in our system. So we can till, but there's so much residue. We leave all of our straw on the field from our oats and our wheat. Nothing gets baled off. And so when you can think of a 140 bushel oat crop or a 120 bushel wheat crop, there's a tremendous amount of material there. We want the material because if we're trying to increase the organic matter, selling bales of straw is not part of our program, but managing that is so challenging. And times when we've gone through with a set of discs or our vertical till tool, it really hasn't done much at managing that residue. We're quite cold here in the wintertime. Like we're minus, it can get down to minus 30 degrees Celsius, which is close to minus 25 Fahrenheit. And there just isn't enough time for the worms and the biology to break down all that residue during the summer months. Our growing seasons are short enough. And so tillage isn't really a great option for us. Fall termination works well. You don't get the regrowth in the springtime. It's a little bit easier to plant into. But like I mentioned earlier, we want those living roots on our soils 11 and a half months of the year, because we see that being so critical to the biology that cycles those nutrients and breaks down that residue. So we like to leave it green as long as we can. And so we've got the option of spring termination, and we can terminate those crops really early, like in end of April, and let all the plants die down for 2 or 3 weeks before we plant, or we can plant directly into those cover crops and terminate them generally on the day we plant or the day before or the day after. That seems to be a good scenario for us. The cover crops retain a tremendous amount of moisture. Anyone that says cover crops steal moisture hasn't grown red clover, because in our scenarios where we've had a dry year, any field that had a cover crop in it retained a tremendous amount of moisture. We had almost mucky loam soil underneath those cover crops, and the second they were terminated, the soil dried out. We've also mowed. So we have a 20-foot batwing mower, and we like to use it in our wheat crops specifically, where we have a flush of clover after harvest. We've still got all the residue. We often have to cut our wheat fairly tall because of the underseeded clover, and the mower does a great job of taking care of that foot of residue that's above. It also triggers all the volunteer wheat seeds that are left in the heads that maybe didn't get harvested to germinate. And it also triggers the clover to grow quite rapidly after it's been clipped. And so mowing is a fast technique for us to get everything on the ground. Now it's got some soil contact. The worms can access it. The biology can start to break it down, and it does great for the clover growth. And then, as I mentioned, removal. Removal to me seems like the best option at our size and scale, and putting it through the compost program. It retains the nutrients, it retains a lot of that organic matter that we want, but we're not breaking it down in the field, and it's not a hindrance to our cropping systems. With the residue that we were dealing with over the last few years, it was really costing us yield. And comparatively to fields that were either clean or tilled, we were seeing an economic difference that was significant enough that we had to come up with a different solution. I do see in our system grazing as an option. It's going to be difficult for us to get to a total grazing system in our current setup. We would probably require about 1,000 sheep to do that effectively. And so that's probably not practical or realistic or on the agenda of my shepherdess who looks after the flock. But at the same time, we do see it as a great part of our circular system. And the more acres that we can put those sheep on, the better it is in cycling those nutrients and adding fertility to the soil as well. Or a combination thereof. So in our system, there's no one shape that fits all. It really is dependent on where the fields are located relative to the flock, what we're trying to achieve as far as fertility and managing the various landscapes that we have. And of course, it comes down to time and equipment and staff as well. So we're trying to balance doing the ecological benefits along with the best management practices and coming up with something that we can all live with. So I do want to talk a little bit about what I think for us in our 4-crop rotation, what the best recipe is. We knew that our soils were somewhat tired from a 2-crop rotation, and that's no disrespect to the previous generation that farmed. They were primarily hog producers, and they grew a rotation of just corn and soybeans. Corn was a feedstock for the hogs, and soybeans was a rotation crop. And so when we introduced wheat to the system, it was an opportunity for us to get cover crops. We immediately saw the benefits in terms of time management, in terms of the soil health improving, and the cover crops being there was just a perfect total package for us. In our current climate, planting wheat after soybeans is very challenging. Our soybeans are typically harvested in mid to late October. We like to be done by Halloween, but when you plant wheat at that time of year, the wheat might just sprout. And we find, well, we know statistically that our optimal planting date is September 15th. And so for every day after our optimal planting date, we lose a bushel of yield. That's the rule that's been determined. And the earlier we can plant our wheat, the better yield we get, the less disease we have, and the overall better crop we have as a whole. So to achieve that earlier planting date, we're not harvesting beans in September, very rarely. We decided to add oats into the crop, into the mixture. Oats has no disease carryover to wheat, so we can plant our wheat directly after oats. Oats give us another opportunity to graze some acres in the summertime for the sheep, and it gives us a window of about 6 to 8 weeks from harvest to the time that we would want to plant our wheat optimally. And so that gives us time to still grow that underseeded cover crop. And it's so our first crop is corn, our second crop is beans, our third crop is oats, and our fourth crop is wheat. So our recipe that we find works best is the management of our corn crop starts following our wheat harvest. And so if we mow that wheat field about a month after the wheat's been harvested, we put all that residue on the ground, the clover's had a chance to flush out, we give it a quick clip, and that clover just takes off. We want to graze that in the spring where we can, but that could also be grazed in the fall, as was the case in the pictures that I was showing you. We'll no-till our corn into what's left. So there'll be a little bit of volunteer wheat that's still growing. There'll be a little bit of clover, but not as much. And the other option there is we can cut or compost it. And then once the corn's growing, we'll interseed that corn with the cover crop at that 6 to 8 leaf stage. Our soybeans are pretty straightforward, much like you would do in your area. For anyone that's no-tilling, we'll no-till those beans directly into the previous year's corn crop. We're in 30-inch rows, so we plant our soybeans directly between the rows of corn, and then we keep those fields pretty clean. We have not been able to find a good solution for planting cover crops in our soybeans. We've tried some buckwheat broadcast at sort of the leaf drop timing. The buckwheat germinated, but it really didn't do much as far as a cover crop. We've tried some aerial application of rye and oats, and again, just not really getting a great stand because of the timing. And so we'll generally keep our bean fields pretty clean. We're on a two spray program for them. And that clean field is really great for planting oats the following spring. We don't have to do any spring herbicide program under that. We'll directly drill the oats in late April, ideally. As soon as the ground dries out, the earliest we can get into the field, we're drilling. And we'll put the red clover seed either directly in with the seed, or we'll broadcast it ahead of the drill. And so if we're doing any dry fertilizer for our oats, we'll put the red clover seed in with the dry fertilizer and blast it out through the airflow, and then drill directly into that. That kind of incorporates the little bit of fertilizer and clover as well. And then we'll graze that clover 2 to 3 weeks after harvest, or if it's not grazed, we'll cut and compost it. 2 to 3 weeks, believe it or not, is still a pretty good clover crop at that point. There's lots of root structure underneath. And by cutting it and composting it, we're taking all of that oat straw, all of the oat stubble, all of the clover off the field, and putting it in the windrows. If we do graze it, or if we do cut it, we'll typically terminate 2 to 3 weeks after that. Again, just to give it another chance to have a quick flush. You have that rapid growth. You have excellent herbicide efficacy. You're really spraying stubble at that point, or very small plants, so you don't need much chemical, and that seems to work quite well. In the wheat scenario, we'll plant the wheat will be planted 2 to 3 weeks after the termination of the oats, and we try to minimize the amount of volunteer oats in that scenario. And if they're there, we've planted directly into essentially a green carpet, and had pretty good success with it. Our red clover for wheat is generally frost seeded. Again, if we're going in with a dry fertilizer application in crop on frost, then we'll throw the red clover seed in with that. Or otherwise, it's generally done on an ATV with a spinner spreader, and that can be a very cold experience, and you have to go out at 5 in the morning ahead of the sun coming out, because you do it on frost, but you want to do it on those warmer days. And it's not that fun, but it is what it is. And in our ideal scenario, all of our amendments would be placed on the field post-harvest. So any compost, any dry fertilizer, and we're even thinking of doing, a 4-year dry fertilizer program, like putting all of our elemental sulfur, all of our potassium, and if any phosphorus is needed, which is not the case in most of our fields, we would do that immediately after wheat harvest, but prior to mowing. And again, some action or some traffic on top of that fertilizer just helps press it into the ground and reduces any risk of loss. But it's in so much residue at that point anyway, it's not really going anywhere. So that in our system seems to work pretty well. It deviates every year, but if I had to dream up the perfect scenario for what we have, our equipment, our staff, our animals, and the fields and crops that we're growing, this was sort of what it would look like. And where we've had our best success is when we've pieced these crops together with that type of activity. So that sort of wraps up my presentation and what we're doing. And I really, once again, want to thank PFI for bringing me into this discussion and sharing my experiences with you. I learned a lot from your team and your growers when I visited with you last winter. And yeah, I'm here to answer any questions anyone might have about any of these scenarios.
All right, thank you so much, Norm. That was great. As he just said, if you have any questions, feel free to type them in the chat. I'll give everyone a moment here, and we'll see what pops up. Okay, here's one. Would you use any other animals for grazing?
Yeah, we went with sheep only because I had a friend who was interested in getting into farming, and she loved the idea of owning some sheep. So we helped her get into a flock of sheep, and it's kind of grown from there. Yes, I would absolutely love to have some cattle on the fields. We've kind of tailored some of our cover crop and our multi-species mixes to what the sheep will be consuming. Clover's been a great success. Another one of my staff members has already purchased 2 cows for next year, and he's going to start with that and hopefully grow a herd from there. But ideally, I would love to have animals grazing throughout the growth cycle of my crops. And really, the only time we struggle to find a place for the animals is between late May and early July. So there's a 6-week period there when we don't have a cover crop. We have lots of hay ground, so we typically grazing them there, but then we're sacrificing a cut of hay for those acres for our horse market. But it's not a big deal. And then we're feeding the sheep dry hay in feeders in a field throughout the winter. So we hardly have any manure to deal with. And I like that system. And so if we had cattle, I would do something similar to that.
Perfect. Someone else wants to know what kind of chemical or chemicals do you use to terminate?
Yeah, so any crops that we have to terminate, so any overwintering cover crops, and I'm thinking about red clover specifically, we'll generally use a glyphosate with the 2,4-D product. Again, where we can mow those crops and have a flush, we don't need as much of it, obviously. But in most cases, we're terminating at planting in a pretty lush crop.
Right, perfect. Thank you. Perhaps you can share a bit more about some of your more recent research or perhaps any trials that you may have planned.
Yeah, thanks, Solveig. That's a whole other presentation right there. We have about 6 active partners on the farm that are doing research, and that's everything from looking at nitrogen inhibitors and nitrogen minimization in terms of nitrogen efficiency use in crops. We have the on-farm project that's looking at rotations and cover crops and soil amendments. We have another one that's looking at the nitrogen release of our cover crops and how to time when those cover crops are going to release the nitrogen for the subsequent crop. We haven't given a lot of nitrogen credit from the cover crops to the subsequent crop. We need a lot of nitrogen to break down the residues as well. And so we're trying to figure out, when's the best time to put the compost on which crop, and when's the best time to terminate a cover crop so that its nitrogen or the bacterial activity from the residue breakdown occurs to the subsequent crop. So yeah, there's a lot of activity going on. We had some great nitrogen efficiency numbers last year. we actually never met our MERN, which is minimum economic return for nitrogen, on any of our fields. So what that means is that for every pound of nitrogen we would apply to that crop, we were still seeing an economic return, even at 120% last year. Phenomenal growing season for us. But we were growing, in the best case scenarios, we were growing a bushel of corn on 0.47 units of nitrogen. And so we're trying to balance our ecological impacts of fertilizer use along with the economic impacts of feeding my family, and those are things that we are always trying to tweak to try to get to the right numbers on.
Yeah, it does sound like it could be a whole other presentation. All right, this one's a two-part question. Do you have any concerns with the application of municipal waste to your fields? And second, have you had any issues with the bagged residue quality for your composting enterprises, such as trash?
Yeah, in both scenarios in Ontario, those are both highly regulated. So the municipal wastes, we're talking biosolids that come out of waste treatment plants, are very strictly regulated. They're treated, they're filtered. We get heavy metal testing from every load that comes out of the plants, and get field applied. Soil sampling is done, and that material is only applied up to the thresholds that the plants are going to utilize through the growth cycle. What we don't get a lot of information on is pharmaceuticals, and certainly when you talk about antibiotics and what their purpose is to kill biology, and if we're trying to improve biology in the soil, long term I probably would want to wean those out once I've got my soil to where I am. But for the time being, that the nutrient value of those products is significant. In our case, they're applied on our land for free. So there's no cost to the farmer. The material's free and the application is free. And so the cost benefit of using that product is significant. In the case of the bagged residues, similarly, we have a license to operate as a waste management facility to receive that material. We have a license to process that material. And then from OMAFRA, our governing agriculture body, we have a license to store that material and field apply it. And when we field apply that material, it has to be tested at a lab. So we send it in for analysis. We get all of your typical agronomic analysis done on it, and then we apply based on the nutrient value of those. In terms of foreign materials in that program, it's minimal. There's certainly the odd bag or the odd pop can, or something that's been raked up from someone's lawn, but overall it's quite clean relative to a green waste like your kitchen yard waste or your kitchen waste. That program there is pretty clean from that perspective. We're able to screen out some of that material when we're offloading it through the machine, the mixer that we have, and yeah, we take out the majority of that foreign material before it gets land applied.
Thank you. All right. If anyone has any last questions, we still have a few minutes. Feel free to put them in the chat. Again, the chat is at the bottom of your screen. It's in a little bubble and it says chat below. So yeah, if you have a question, type it there. Yeah, and thank you. That was a really good explanation of how things can wind up in the field, the regulations behind it. I'll give it a minute, can take a little time to type. Okay. Have you ever tried another legume cover other than red clover?
Yeah, we use one of my favorites in corn are peas, just a standard cow pea. They seem to germinate really well on the surface. They're a larger seed. They swell up pretty quickly, and we've had really good luck with the peas. Other legumes that we've tried, we've had alfalfa in the mix as well. Trying to think of what others we would have used. Yeah, those are probably the three main ones that we're using, but certainly the peas are they're a staple for us in the corn application. We'll put them in with an oat or a rye, along with some crimson clover and sometimes some vetch as well. We're trying to grow more and more of our own cover crop seeds. So we've got 5 acres of rye planted right now that we'll use in the mix because we're growing oats. Oats make a great cover crop. Any fines or light oats that we can extract from our cleaning process, we'll set those aside to be used as part of the cover crop mix, and then the rest of the blends we will buy.
I have a quick question about that, I guess, while we're waiting for something. So you're growing your own seed for cover crops. So do you rotate those, or do you have like separate fields that are primarily growing those seed and then you interlay them onto your other fields?
Yeah, we treat them as a crop. And so in the case of rye, it's very similar to wheat and has similar disease pressures that wheat would have. And so we'll just put it in a field where wheat was scheduled to go as part of the rotation. We've grown a little bit of barley as well for a local brewery. I think there was a picture of barley there in on my crop slide. And yeah, same thing. We'll rotate those in based on the specs of that crop.
Okay. Thanks for that. What are your row widths for your corn and beans?
Yeah, we're on 30 inches for both corn and beans. If we were to buy a different drill, I would probably narrow the bean widths up. The quicker you can get those beans to canopy, the easier it is to control weeds. We like the planter for beans. The emergence is excellent. We're trying to grow varieties that are a little bit bushier in characteristics, and we've had pretty good success at closing canopy on our beans most years, unless it's really dry. Our population on corn in this area is in that 33,000 range, and our population on beans is anywhere between 120,000 and 180,000, depending on the ground. And we have done some variable rate work on soybeans as well, and they seem to be very responsive to that.
All right, perfect. What small grain varieties do you grow for your grain or cover seed?
Yeah, so our combine's not great at red clover, so we've never grown red clover before. The only one that we're playing with right now is rye. It harvests pretty well and matures at a timing when we can harvest it, because we're harvesting 2 cereals in the summertime. So half of all our crops are being harvested in summer, and everyone likes to take holidays and kids are off school and things of that sort. So we're trying not to grow too many, but I like the idea of the concept of growing a third grain that we can harvest for a cover crop that we keep. And then, like I mentioned, oats is an easy one for us because we can hold back some of that seed and use it as a cover crop in the rotations.
All right, perfect. And then there's some curiosity to a topic not really relevant to today, but can you share a bit more about your maple syrup and greenhouse operations, and how many people do you actually have working farms? Because it sounds like there's a lot going on there.
Yeah, I'm really fortunate. My in-laws are still very much involved. They've been wonderful at sort of handing over the keys to the operation from the farming standpoint, but they're extremely involved in the market garden, greenhouse, and the maple syrup operation. So they're in their early 80s now, and they're on site here every single day doing something, which is great. They built a house across the road from the home farm here, and have been a really positive transition story for us. And so they kind of manage those 3. My son's helping out with the greenhouse operation. It's a passive solar greenhouse. There's some pretty cool information about it up on our website, or if you look in my past Facebook posts, we went through the whole story of how it was built. And then as far as how many people work here, yeah, we're at the moment 4 full-time employees, and we'll hire some seasonal staff in the summertime. Plus my in-laws, my kids help out a little bit on the farm. And now that we're expanding into the biochar and the forestry operations, I'm looking to hire 2 to 3 more people here in the next 12 months to allow me to do more of these types of things.
Perfect. I have a question real quick. We still have a few minutes left. You had mentioned earlier in your presentation that some of your cover crops, I can't recall if it was clover, I thought, actually retain a lot of that moisture to the point where it's a bit, I think you said soupy or something similar to that. Does that have any effect later on as you're planting your more like traditional row crops, or does it cause any issues on later on down the road?
It can. So I think I used the word tacky. It's very sticky, like you can almost model it. And then for a loam, you don't generally get those characteristics. What it really does is it doesn't allow the sunlight to hit the soil. And so when you have that cover crop there, it's sheltering the moisture that's in the soil. And when you have a year where we've had a lot of snow and there's a lot of moisture in the ground, not all our ground is tiled. We don't have a lot of wet spots, but we do retain moisture in the soil. And yeah, there's been issues like that scenario last year where we planted directly into the volunteer wheat and clover field. There was a bit of sidewall compaction, and we certainly saw that on the yield monitors when we harvested the crop. So emergence was maybe 90% of what it should have been, and it struggled through the year as a result of that. And when we dug up some roots, we did see that sidewall compaction throughout. Not much we could have done in that scenario. We would have had to probably wait 2 or 3 weeks after that, and that would have been a little bit too late for that corn crop. So, yeah, it's not always perfect, but we manage it as best we can. And being a smallish farm and only planting 150 acres of each crop, it really does allow us to wait a few days to go into the field and wait for those optimal temperatures and moisture conditions to plant the crops. And that's done really well for us. We haven't suffered on planting late because of our cover crops and the termination, and we wanted to flush because the chemical has to be taken up by the plant. We are planting a week or two later than some of our neighbors.
Right. Well, thank you. I don't see any more questions coming in, and it's 1 o'clock. So thank you so much, Norm, for giving this great presentation today. And thank you everyone else for joining us today. And if you're interested, we'll see you again next week. So thank you. Norm, you can stay on for a minute if you want.
Yeah, no problem.